Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. Over half of U.S. states now require high school students to receive a financial literacy course before they graduate, after Governor Gavin Newsom signed a bill passed by the California Legislature. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, unpack this new law for us.
Yeah, so essentially the legislature and California's Governor Gavin Newsom, they have signed off on a bill that would require students, I believe starting in graduating class of 2031, to have a personal finance course. So this covers a lot of different kinds of things, but it's like budgeting, taking out credit, different kinds of loan options, financing college, a lot of different kinds of things that, advocates of personal finance say is really important for students to have for after high school, right? That it's important that they know how to balance their checkbook, or like open up a bank account or start investing, those kinds of things that you might naturally know from your parents, or maybe if you grew up somewhere and your parents didn't maybe have access to a bank, or, there's different kinds of scenarios. I think that people really kind of stress that it's really important for students to have access to this kind of information. So that's kind of the impetus behind the bill. There's different kinds of nonprofits out there. One of them is called Next Gen Personal Finance, and they actually partnered with, they were like instrumental, I think, in sort of behind the scenes with this legislation in California. So there was a press release that was between Governor Newsom's office and the Next Gen Personal Finance. And they have like a big push. They're trying to get, I think, all states to have some kind of requirement for a personal finance course for high school students before 2030, I believe. So that's their own kind of thing. But that's sort of the background, I think, behind it. This has been happening for a while. This is not the first. This is the 26th state, which puts the country over the tipping point. And California is a very large state with a lot of people in it. But in 2020, there were only 8 states that had these kinds of laws, according to that nonprofit NGPF, Next Gen Personal Finance. And then by 2021, there was 11 states. 2022, there were 17 states. And so, we've kind of seen like this gradual growth in states that have the personal finance requirements. And again, that's just like a mandate of like, by the end of their senior year, in order to graduate, students will have taken one of these personal finance classes. So that's kind of the background there.
And how much is this expected to cost?
Yeah, that is a great question. So there's a great thing about a lot of legislatures is that they have sort of these documents that say how much it's going to cost to implement. And the one from the Senate Appropriations Committee in California estimated that it would cost between $130 to $195 million each year. And that does not include a $271,000 one-time cost from the general fund. That would be like over 2 years for this committee to, basically develop the curriculum and the resources to the personal finance course. So they basically took a salary, $100,000 to $150,000 for a credentialed teacher. And I think they're including benefits in that for each of the state's 1,300 high schools. And they're sort of drawing that out, and that's how they got that number of $130 million to $195 million. So it's not cheap to implement necessarily, but at the same time, we're sort of looking at an entire state. And so adding one new teacher to an entire state, you just kind of have to put that in context of like, this is, we're talking billions of dollars that they go toward the schools. And so it's kind of a, relatively might be a drop in the bucket, but it's not free to make these kinds of changes, even 5 years down the road, right? There are costs involved and implementation costs as well. So this stuff is gonna, it is going to add some amount of cost. But I think, proponents of it can say, well, it's worth the investment because then our students will be able to, sort of make wise financial choices, and that will benefit them in the future.
And there's obviously a lot of benefits to this idea that advocates argue, but there have been some concerns surrounding it as well. Can you get into that?
Yeah, I think with any kind of mandate on, this is what students should take in high school, right? I think there is some pushback occasionally. There can be pushback, and there was in this case from people who are saying, well, what about this other course, right? So anytime you add, okay, there's a course requirement and we're saying you have to take another course, that kind of limits the opportunities that you might have to take a different course that somebody else says is also, incredibly important. Like the California Council for Social Studies, for the Social Studies, they asked the legislature to think about the fact that if you're requiring students to take a personal finance course, like what about the economics classes that sort of cover this, that have been around for a long time? Like, then will students have to forego the economics course and kind of understand this and, a broader understanding of the economy if they have to choose between them? And so I think that is, basically anytime you're going to add a requirement in, it's important to think about like, well, what are you taking out of the equation there? Because there's only so many classes you can take. Is it an elective? Is it, the economics course in this case?
And what are the possible wider implications of this law? California, as you mentioned before, is a big state with a lot of people, has a lot of influence. What could we see going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a good sign for advocates of personal finance classes. I mean, it's a big state, and it's kind of over the tipping point, right? There's 26 states. I think that kind of shows like, hey, they've built up a lot. There's going to be, there's a lot of states that look to California, I think, for sort of these policy direction, and they've seen like, okay, this is very successful here in sort of this progressive stronghold. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing, and it can shape curriculum. So if you have curriculum providers, right, who are creating personal finance classes, they're looking at California's law and thinking, okay, how do we fulfill the nature of the law? And one interesting part of that is, there's like, I think, requirements in California's law to talk about the workplace readiness week. So there's like previous law on the books in California, which has teachers talking about union organizing and different kinds of bargaining rights and that kind of thing that might be included in personal finance classes in order to make sure that it's up to the California code, right, of making sure that it's up to California's law. So I think that's, some of the implications there are that, and we've seen this with car manufacturers too, is that essentially you kind of pander to some of the larger states where you have the most people.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.